news for August the 2nd, 2024. I am Brett Burney from appsandlaw.com.
And this is Jeff Richardson from iPhone JD. Hey, Brett.
Hey, Jeff. Special edition time.
Oh, I'm excited.
We usually love to go through your Friday in the news post on iPhone JD, which I have been reading for many, many, many years. And it's just always been a thrill for me to do this podcast with you. But at least once a year or so, we like to do kind of a special edition. And this one I'm very excited about.
Me too.
We came up with this idea. Let's do a walkthrough mobile devices that you and I used leading up to the iPhone. Now, the only kind of I think the caveat we wanted to put on this is like we didn't want to go through all of the phones. Like I don't know, I'm sure you did the same, Jeff. I had several like Motorola flip phones and different candy bar phones and stuff. But really, it was you're going all the way back to '89, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But it was like some of these like personal digital assistants, I guess, is more the better way to kind of put it.
Yeah.
PDAs, which I always say that, and my mom from her generation thinks of PDA as standing for something else other than personal digital assistant. But PDAs is sort of this idea of like being able to have access to a lot of information more than just maybe your contacts, to make a phone call. But I'm excited to kind of walk through this memory lane a little bit, Jeff, and just to kind of see, because every time that we do something similar to this, it really just kind of highlights to me the evolution of the technology up to the iPhone, and then of course to see it today, so many years later.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. We all love the iPhone. It's such a powerful little computer in your pocket, but it wasn't the first. I mean, the iPhone came, there were things before the iPhone. You said not as emphasizing the phone side of it, but more of the little mini computer side of it. And so if you look at the history of it, the phrase like you say that we'll often use is PDA. PDA is actually a phrase that was I don't know if you should say invented or popularized. I'm not sure, but one of the two, certainly popularized by Apple CEO John Sculley in the 1990s. He came out with he was in charge of Apple when they came out with the Newton, and he came up with this idea, or at least popularized it, of calling it a PDA, the personal digital assistant. But the Newton was not the first PDA. The first PDA, depending upon how you want to describe it, really was in the 80s. There was a company called Psion, Psion, and they had a number of devices over the years. I remember that, for a while, my brother used to use one that looked like a little mini computer, but they came up with something that you're showing on the screen right now, which was in the mid 80s, and it was the very first idea of something that you would carry around and that you could store information in it. So it almost looked like a calculator, but you could store other types of information, calendar entries and notes and things like that. So that's where it sort of came. But I mean, again, that first Psion thing, that was not a big seller. It was a very small device, but it was in the late 80s that the idea of having something digital that you could store information with started to become popular. I mean, I remember in the early 80s, there was some Casio watches that, were sort of, you could store some limited information in them and stuff. But I was always looking for this because I was always a technology geek. I graduated from high school in 1987, so I started college in 87, and I wanted something to sort of keep track of my information, my little notes of information, my calendar, my contacts. And I remember it was right around 1989, so I was sort of a sophomore, junior in college, when this category first started to become more popular. In '89, there was a whole bunch of companies that came out with versions of these organizers, and there were some of them that were a little bit more expensive. For example, Sharp had one called the Sharp Wizard, which was around $300. And I used to really, I was envious of the Sharp Wizard because it had lots of cool functions. But for me, on a college budget, given the value of $1 at the time in the 1989, $300 was a little too rich for my blood. So I never had that one. Casio had a series called the Boss, which was the same idea. Psion, of course, we just mentioned. Psion had their organizers. So those were sort of the higher end ones in the 1980s. My very first organizer, I don't remember the name of it. I know that it was sort of like a lower end Casio or Sharp or one of those sorts of things. But it was a way that when I was in college, I could keep track of my upcoming appointments. I could keep track of my phone numbers and stuff like that. And I had a notes section it's sort of akin to the Notes app on the iPhone where I could just like jot down bits of information, and I would carry this little device with me. And it was really, I liked it. I mean, it was incredibly primitive at the time, but I got into the idea of having this digital device with me at all time that could have information. The first one that I had that was really started to become what at the time I considered popular was in 1993 when I was in law school, and Sharp came up with this product that was called the YO310 that you're showing on the screen right now. We should mention, by the way, that I know this is an audio podcast, but if you're ever going to look at the YouTube video of this podcast, this is a good episode to do it, because Brett is, as I'm talking, and Brett's going to do the same when he's talking, we're bringing up all of these images of these things from the past that, you know, the picture's worth 1,000 words. You almost want to look at these things to really see what we're talking about. But the Sharp devices, there was a couple of models. I remember using this YO310 because it had 64K of memory, which to me just seemed like more memory than I would ever possibly need. And it had all the basic functions. It was sort of a clamshell design, so you would open it up, and it was almost like a mini laptop. So the top part would have just a couple lines of an LCD display, and the bottom part would have a little chiclet keyboard. But it allowed me to type things in there. And again, I used to use it for the calendar, contacts, notes, a calculator. This one was cool because it was the first one that I ever used that it had a way, it wasn't just self-contained. So you weren't just putting stuff in there to never get it out, but it actually had a link on the left side of it. You could see it actually written on the side there, a computer link that you could connect a proprietary cord and connect it to your computer just as a backup. And so the idea is that my information wasn't locked forever on the organizer. It was on my computer. And I knew at the time that meant that in the future, when I upgraded to whatever, the next great model, I'd be able to transfer information from one device to another, which is really, really nice. And so that was the first device that I used. And it was also right around this time period in the 1990s when Apple came out with its Newton, which was very expensive, and it had the stylus and all that sort of stuff. And Newton tried to have an interface where you used a stylus to write things on it. And for that interface to work well, it would have to understand each of your letters as you wrote them. And of course, they were lampooned in the beginning by the infamous Simpsons episode where somebody says something like, I forget. I remember the joke was Nelson writes something that was supposed to be go to the store, and it changed it to like eat up Martha or something that made no sense. But the idea is that the character recognition was not very accurate in those early models. But the Newton was a pretty revolutionary device. It was bigger than what I wanted because it couldn't fit in your pocket. But it was this early idea of a really powerful little personal assistant that you could carry around and do stuff with you. I stayed on the small side though. So I liked that Sharp device that I was using was something really, really small. And then the big change for me was in the late 1990s, when Palm came up with its devices. And let me just talk about this for a second. So Palm was just such a revolutionary company at the time. One of the founders was, what is his name? Jeff, I'm blanking on his last name.
Yeah, me too. I'll find it. But
it'll come up in a second. But he had this idea of, he wanted to have a device that he could carry with him. And he's like, I know that I often have shirts, as I'm wearing right now, that have a pocket. And so he said, Jeff Hawkins, I think it is. He says, I want to, he went into his little workshop, and he carved a piece of wood. That was just a piece of wood. And he carved all sorts of different sizes. And he would just carry around these pieces of wood in his pocket until he found the size that was big enough without being too big. And so then he said, okay, so this is the aim. We need something that's the size of this piece of wood. And then they went to start develop it. And they ultimately came up with something that was called the Palm Pilot, which was this personal organizer. It, much like the Newton, it had a stylus, but unlike the Newton, it used a special vocabulary that was called graffiti, so that, for example, in order to make certain letters, like to make the letter A, you would just go up and come down, and then that would make an A. Or it was, so the keystrokes were very similar to what you, not the keystrokes, the brush strokes were similar to an actual letter in the English alphabet, but were just unique enough that it made it much easier for the device to understand what you were doing. So you're showing on your screen right now some of the prototypes that he did.
That's right.
They came out with the Palm Pilot. The company sort of ran out of money and had to be purchased by US Robotics to even be able to come to production with this stuff. But eventually it came to market. And when the first Palm Pilot came to market in the late 90s, it was revolutionary because it
It's
was
big.
so easy to carry, but it
Right.
could do so much. It had a nice screen. It was easy to put input in, relatively easy because of the stylus and the graffiti system. And it's synced to a computer, and it's like, wow, this is really cool. I did not get the very first generation. The first one that I got was the Palm 3, which you're showing right now. I said US Robotics. It
Okay.
was, well, this says 3Com, but US
3Com.
Robotics was
Yeah.
involved at some
Yeah.
point too. I forget how that all
They
worked,
were.
but
You're right.
regardless,
You're right.
um, anyway, but the Palm 3 was the first one I had, which was just sort of a subsequent generation of it. And it was, it was nice. It had all these, nobody used the word app at the time. That was a term that would become
Right. That's
popularized
right.
much later by Steve Jobs, but it had what today we would call apps. There would be an app for the calendar and an app for the notes. Plus, the Palm was the first device that I used. Now, the Newton did this earlier, but it was the first device that I used that you could have third-party apps installed. And so I would
Right.
go to a computer store and you would buy a box off the shelf of some app and you would install it on your phone. And it was really, really useful. And I used it. I mean, it was just really perfect ancillary to my law practice that I put all this information in it. And it got to the
Right.
point where I was using this enough. I mean, I got it in 1998, but by the year 2000, I was actually using the Palm enough that I started to talk with other lawyers, and there were articles written about, is this going to affect the law practice and stuff? And in fact, I had sent you, Brett, if you can find it.
Yeah.
I had done
Right here.
a presentation for lawyers in the year 2000 about using a Palm in your law practice. At this point, I had moved on to the Palm 3C, which was just a color version of the Palm 3 that I
Palms
have.
in the law.
And I did this whole presentation on how lawyers and really any professional would use a Palm not to replace your computer, but just as sort of a portable version that you could carry around with you. And one of the nice things about the Palm is that it's synced to the computer, so much like that old Sharp
Yeah.
visor. But that was important because at the time there was no Wi-Fi, there was no built-in internet, there was no phone connection. And so the
Crazy to
only
think.
way
Yeah.
for you to get new information on there is you would sync it to the computer. Everything that you had typed into it would be backed up, but then any new information that the computer would download would be synced back over to it. And so you could also like update like a contact entry in your computer. It had like this little cradle that you would connect to your computer, so you could stick it in the
Uh-huh. Hot
cradle.
hot
You could
sync. It was the
you could
hot
press a
sync
button to sync it.
cradle.
We'd also
Yeah.
charge it at the same time. They also had like external keyboards that you could use for it as well. There was one that Palm made, which sort of folded up. And I remember times, Brett,
So
when I would
weird.
travel for work, that I had my Palm device and I
Right.
had my little fold-up keyboard, which were both so tiny I could stick them in a pocket. And then I really had everything I needed. So like I would go take a plane ride as a lawyer to go do like a deposition or something. And on the
Right.
way back, just right there on my tray on the plane, I would open up my keyboard. I would stick my Palm device in there and I would type up my summary of the deposition. And then by the time the plane ride was over, I had already drafted my client report. And these are the days before, yes, we had some portable computers at the time, for sure, because those came out in the 90s, but they were so much bigger and this was so tiny and light and I could fit it in my pocket. I
Yeah.
just thought it was the bee's knees to have all of this cool technology with the Palm and third-party apps.
That's
I
so
mentioned one
great.
one other thing about the Palm that I used to love is that I could take documents on my computer, like a Microsoft Word document, and I could actually move them over to the Palm using software from a company called DataViz, where you
Oh,
would be able to
yes. I remember.
it's like it wasn't Microsoft Word for the Palm, but it was a program that would basically understand how to read Word documents and put them into a text-only format so that you could actually read documents. So I could take documents with me along the way. It was really revolutionary, and it was a big part of my practice. I loved using the Palm, and I felt like for me, and this is the same way I think of my iPhone today. I often call my iPhone like my external brain. My brain does not remember everything in life, but the
Right.
things that I don't
Right.
remember, they're in my phone. And so if I need to find a phone number for somebody, if I need to find a note from a couple of years ago, whatever it is I need, I may not know it in my brain, but it's on my iPhone. But it all goes back to the Palm. I mean, it all goes back even earlier to my Sharp device. But really, with the Palm, that's when I was putting all of my important information in there, whether it related to my personal life or my business life.
Right.
Oh, loved it so much. So that brings me up to the year 2000. And so, where were you in the year 2000?
I remember, so for my standpoint, it's weird how it kind of goes with like your educational aspect. I was in law school 97 to 2000. So I remember in law school, like I wasn't having, I mean, I couldn't afford anything on this aspect. But for me, at least, you know, I carried my laptop everywhere that I went. And that was just, you know, we were only studying and not really doing a whole lot else on something. And I didn't need anything else. But I remember my first job, I get out and I at a law firm, and I specifically remember this because I'm like, okay, now I want to do something. And I've been watching this whole Palm trajectory. Like I knew that they were the bees. I knew that this was the big deal, but all of these screenshots, which by the way, this presentation is fantastic to kind of walk through. And I guess we could even provide the link for folks too, Jeff, to see if they wanted to go through and see it on here. But I mean, just to see it, the main thing that maybe would jump out at you is that this was only a black and white screen, or not even black and white. It was just that greenish screen, so that there wasn't any color, even though you got a couple of slides in here with
so I did
models with
eventually the Palm 3C was in color, but the early models were just black and white.
But the reason I'm bringing that up is at the time I knew, like, okay, I want to get something that is a little more what I would like to see from a color standpoint. And maybe it was just as simple as the color standpoint. Well, at the same time that this was going on, Microsoft was also building up a little bit on the mobile side. Like they knew that this was coming around. They watched Apple, they'd watched Palm, and then there was a couple of other, you know, Blackberry and some of the other companies that were up and coming in this area. And so they started working with other companies, right? Because at the time, Microsoft didn't release a Microsoft product. There was a few kind of in there, but just like they have Windows that can run on a Compaq or HP or, you know, whatever else, they were providing what at the time they called Pocket PC, or it used to be called Windows CE. I can't remember exactly what CE, but Pocket PC was, I thought this cute phrase that they were using was the idea, like, can we basically put a Windows operating system into a mobile device? And there was a few that came out, but the one that I landed on was Casio. I called it my Cassiopeia, but the actual model number was EM500, the Casio EM500 Pocket PC. This is a review from October 2000 from Julie at the Gadgeteer.com website, which is great. But it was running Windows CE version 3.0. It had 16 megabytes of RAM. Now we're talking about 16 gigs of RAM, right? In the phones today, Jeff. But I just remember it had a multimedia slot. It had a stereo headphone jack. It was a little bigger and thicker than some of the Palm devices. But here, I'll get down to some of the screenshots that Julie put into this review here. It was just fascinating. Like, I looked like I was looking at a calendar, like on my computer. I mean, just to see it now, by today's standards, this looks absolutely horrendous. But at the time, it was like, what? Like, I have a full contact card right there on my phone. And I remember even at the time, like, you can even see sort of the idea of the apps. I had an Internet Explorer. Like, there was a web browser built into that. And now again, today we take that for granted. We've been talking about that. But at the time, this was amazing. And look, Pocket Word, Pocket Excel. Like, I wanted that same idea that you were just talking about, Jeff, was the idea, like, I wanted to be able to work on Word documents on a mobile device, but I didn't want to have to, like, use a separate program and kind of, go back and forth. I wanted something that would actually let me work on a Pocket Word version of this. Pocket Outlook. It had a voice recorder on it. This wasn't the best, but I got to say, from all intents and purposes, it was something that, I mean, at that point, I knew this was the future, right? Just like you, Jeff. I started carrying this everywhere. It's a little too thick to put in your shirt pocket unless you wanted it to kind of fall off. But it was absolutely fantastic. Now, again, it did have the capability. I think it may have had, I don't even know if it had Wi-Fi. Like, I remember at the times, even if it did have Wi-Fi, which I don't think that it did, by the way. Let me see if I had it up here.
I don't think it did either at the time,
Yeah, I don't think it did. But what I would do is I remember specifically, I would take, like, archives of websites, Jeff. Like, I would download an archive on a computer, transfer it over to my Cassiopeia so I could surf the web, like, on the Cassiopeia as I was walking around. Like, that's how desperate I was that I wanted to look around on some of that. But anyway, in 2000, that's where I was. Like, it took me a while to catch up to this. I wasn't into, like, the Sharps or I knew that the Palm was just kicking off the ground, but in my mind, at least, I was like, well, the Windows side, that's going to be a little bit more successful. First of all, it's Microsoft. Second of all, I'm already using a Windows computer, right? And I wanted to continue on that trajectory. So that's where I was in the early 2000s.
So two things you mentioned there I want to follow up on. One is platforms, and then one is connectivity. On platforms, nowadays we talk about iPhone versus Android. Way back in the day in the 80s, it was, Mac versus PC. But at this point in time in mobile, it was really there was a ton of players, but one of the big ones was Palm, and then another big one was Microsoft. You called it the Windows CE. I think the CE stood for Compact Edition. Sometimes people that were Palm Palm people that were very in the Palm platform would in a derogatory fashion refer to Windows CE as wince, W-A-N-C-E, because it would make you wince to have that Windows interface on something as beautiful as a screen. But regardless, of the silly little things at the time, there was definitely some things Windows had well because it owned things like Word and could use it in there. But in terms of connectivity, see, at the time, these devices, they didn't have an ability to have like a cell phone inside of them. That technology just wasn't there. And Wi-Fi was at that point only available on some computers. It wasn't available here. And so for my Palm device, if I wanted it to update information from the internet, I would have to go to my computer, sync it. And I actually had a program on my Palm, which was like a news program, and that every time I put it in the cradle and press the button to sync, it would download headlines. And so then throughout the day, I could actually look at my Palm and I could see the headlines, but they were only the news headlines as of the last time that I actually synced to my computer. As an alternative, there were some ways, and they were a little hacky at the time, that you could connect a Palm to a cell phone. Like I remember I had like a Sony Ericsson cell phone at the time, that there was a way that I could connect it to the phone and I could get it to sync data. And it was very, very, incredibly slow, horribly slow at the time. And you would never download anything like there was no internet browsers that you would download web pages. It would just be the text on a website that you would download. But those early days of connectivity were there. So at the time, because PDAs weren't really great with connectivity, it opened up the idea to another kind of device, a device that did have connectivity, that was on 24/7. And this was the beginning of really the first big player in this category was, of course, Blackberry. Blackberry came out originally in the late 1990s. In fact, there's a movie that came out a year or two ago called Blackberry, which is not 100% factual, but it is a fun movie. I do recommend watching it. I watched it a couple of months ago. It's a fun movie that talks about the early days of the Blackberry all the way through the introduction of the iPhone. Definitely worth watching. But they were the first person. Research in Motion was the company up in Canada, and they came up with this device that would be able to sync your email using the cell phone carriers, so that if you carried around the BlackBerry device, if somebody sent you an email, you would be able to read it and respond to it in real time, no matter where you were. This concept is today we don't even think twice about it. But at the time, it was revolutionary, especially for business people, the idea that you could get your business done 24/7. I mean, as a lawyer, gosh, I remember being in seminars in the early 2000s, Brett, where people would say, like, is this good or bad? Because if your clients can reach you 24 hours a day, they're going to demand you to be on call 24 hours a day. And, to a certain degree, that ship has long sailed by now. But it was so nice to be able to have your messages with you. So BlackBerry was definitely one of the leaders, and they had their BlackBerry. And I had one of the first BlackBerrys I had was the one that you're showing right there, the BlackBerry 857, where it had the nice little chiclet keyboard at the bottom. You could read your messages and stuff like that. At the same time, there were also some competitors to BlackBerry that came out, and one of them that we used to use at our firm, in addition to the BlackBerry, was a company called Good Technology, and they had something called the Good G100, which was a little bitty, and again, it was just their version of something very similar to a BlackBerry. And I used the G100 for a while because I thought it was sort of a cool little device. And so I would basically have these two devices with me, right? My Palm was what I would be using for calendar and contacts and notes and information that was a little bit more static. I could change it if I wanted to. But then for the real-time communications of email, and they also had some very limited version of text messaging at the time on the BlackBerry, that's what I would use the BlackBerry and the Good for. And use those devices. So at the same time that this is happening, these small devices are slowly starting to gain the idea of connectivity and devices. And we talked about the different platforms. One of the things that Palm decided to do was to open up the platform and to allow third parties to be sort of using the Palm platform, which is one of the things that led to a company called Handspring, which was very noteworthy. And
Mhm.
I think I remember you. So did you actually have a or did you use a Handspring device back in the day?
I did. So I want to talk just quickly
Uh-huh.
on the G100 because I actually had it too. And I remember at the time I was at a law firm where I was working on the mobile technology side for the lawyers, and we were even looking at the BlackBerry side. And I just wanted to point out. I remember specifically that this G100, it was a little faster. They were experimenting. If you remember this little click wheel that was
Oh, I
in the
love that
middle
wheel. Yeah.
there. I know people love the wheel. People like that a little bit. It seemed like that good worked just a little bit better, synchronizing with even like Microsoft Outlook. Like, in other words, I remember specifically the fact that you could delete an email like on one device and then it would be deleted on your computer when you got back. Like, just a lot of that kind of stuff was again just kind of foreign to the things that we were doing at the time. But good technology was just, I think it was, now it's owned by Motorola, but at the time it was just something that was so amazing. Like I said, bi-directional synchronization with Microsoft Outlook. Well, like we were already using
Actually,
that, right? Yeah, and you didn't have to have the desktop software or the Cradle, and the fact that it could work. Good technology would not just support the G100, but some of those other devices that we're going to talk about here in a little bit too. But I just wanted to underscore that G100, that good technology. I mean, they're still around today in some form or fashion, but that was a big milestone for sure.
so let me mention that real quick. The good company started with their hardware devices. They did not last very long, even though the G100 was a
Yes,
great device.
right.
They eventually became a software only company. And one of the things that made my Palm so powerful is that as I moved to, and we're going to get to the Palm 650 in a second, but as Palms
Yes,
gained the
yes,
ability to be interactive, you would be able to install a good app, the good software app on your Palm to
yes,
actually get
yes.
basically the same type of BlackBerry features of email on a device. Fast forward in time, you said that Good was purchased by Motorola. I actually think, if I
Yeah.
remember correctly, Brett, check me on this. I think Good was eventually purchased by BlackBerry, which was sort of the ultimate irony of, and this is long after the days that BlackBerry had sort
Oh
of
my
become
goodness.
far less relevant than it did. Because I remember
You're
that
right.
deadline.
You
I
are
remember that
correct, sir.
headline years and years ago when I thought to myself, if you had told me that BlackBerry and Good
Yeah,
would be in the same company back in the
you're
early
right.
2000s when they were
You're
such
right.
fierce competitors, I would have been so surprised. But anyway, I've jumped ahead a little bit. But that's sort of jumping to the end of Good.
That's
So that was
that's
the
really cool though.
G100.
Yeah.
I love that you're
Yeah.
bringing up, by the way, an old presentation that you did when you were at Thompson Hine way back when. That's just so funny.
I know.
Um,
And this was a presentation in 2004, but actually I remember we were implementing, G100 like even in 2002, 2003. Like
yeah,
that's at
yeah.
least for my firm and several other firms because people I remember going to this conference and people were just so interested to like hear a little bit more about what is it that you're doing. Now, at this point in time in 2002, I'm going to it's not really cheat, but I was also doing some writing columns for an old magazine called Law Office Computing Magazine,
Oh
Jeff.
yeah, I remember
And then I
that.
was
Yeah.
also doing some reviews for the local newspaper here in Cleveland, the Plain Dealer. And because of that, because I knew this was such a hot topic even in those early 2000s, I was able to get access to a lot of these different devices. So some of these I would
Cool.
use for, 2 or 3 months at a time while I was reviewing
Yeah.
it. And then others, sometimes I would keep them, or sometimes I would just go out and buy it because it was so good. But one of the first in 2002 that I was using is this Handspring. This was the Visor Pro, is what this one is. So, Handspring, as you were talking about, sort of like, I guess a competitor to Palm at the time. They were trying to come up with, they were running Palm operating systems, I believe, but they were designing it a little bit differently. Like you said,
Yeah.
you were referencing some of that. And I just remember that this Visor Pro was interesting to me. Still a monochrome screen. Here, I think I actually have, let me see what I said on this. I can't remember what company that this was for. I said in 2000, this was 2002, reviewing PDAs or handhelds always gets a little dicey because almost everyone has picked a side to what you were talking about earlier, Jeff. You either go with a Palm OS or Microsoft's Pocket PC. And so I said, if you want to go simple, go with the Palm. But if you're looking for a mini computer to play games and play music files and a little bit more, then spend a little bit more for the Pocket PC. That's what I said way back in the day. But
That's
we were
funny.
just really seeing a plethora of kind of these different, not just from Handspring, but just at this point, it was really starting to take off. Like everybody wanted to have some kind of a handheld, computing device that they were going to be able to take around with them. And this Handspring Visor Pro was one of the first that was coming up. Another one, just
Yeah.
quickly, I'll say in around 2002. was I was also reviewing a Palm device. This is the i705. And again, these were just sort of incremental improvements. I think a lot of this also had a cradle. This obviously all of these had stylus. At the time, they all still had hardware buttons that they were doing, that they were incorporating. Here, I think, is another review that I did on the i705. Let me see what I said. Here, I said, we already have some PDA cell phone combos, but they weren't very good. Some BlackBerry type devices. And I said, somewhere in the middle comes the Palm's i705 handheld.
Yeah.
And I said I was pretty fond of it at the time, but the wireless network, they were starting to use wireless networks for this, but they called them for email and for, quote, web clippings. So and I said right there, I said, it's too slow to do any serious work, but that was when the writing was just starting to be on the wall. Like you said, Jeff, we'd already had the BlackBerry idea. We had the idea of G100 getting access to your mail. Like, it would be great. Could we just surf the web then at that point? And boy, it took a while for that to come on board. But as we started to see in these early 2000s, that's when it started. Sounds like you also did some Palm devices during that time as well.
So there was lots of variety during this period of time. You know, on the
Right.
one hand, Palm itself was coming up with lots of different types of devices. There was a sort of a slimmer version of the Palm called the Palm 5, which was incredibly popular
Yeah.
because it was so sleek. My wife had one of those. There was bigger ones. Eventually there was something called the Palm Tungsten, which was a little bit more high end and had some high end
Yep.
features. And then although most of the Palms did not have
Nice.
interactivity features, there was some of them, like you just mentioned, the Palm 7 line, including the 705, which did actually work with a very simplistic cellular network to transmit
Right.
very
Right.
slowly information. And I never got one of those at the time because, first of all, you have to pay for the cell phone service every month. And
Sure.
second of all, it was so slow that I just didn't think it was worth it because I could just sync to my phone at the time. But it was a neat thing. It was neat to see the variety. Handspring, by the way, you mentioned the Handspring company. If I remember
Yes.
correctly, it was
Yes.
actually founded by some of the original Palm designers, Palm founders that went over there, and they were coming up with their own versions of a Palm using the same Palm operating system, but doing some interesting hardware features. One of the things that some of those initial Handspring visors would do is they had an expansion pack on the side that you could plug in different things, like, for example, a cellular connectivity thing or some other little hardware devices, a camera and other things like that. But there was a
Right.
lot of variety.
Right.
You know, people were very much trying to figure out what do people want, both on the
Yes.
Pocket PC side and the Windows CE side, and also on the Palm side. There was just all this variety coming out of different devices. For me, the next real watershed moment was when Palm came out with the Palm Treo line. And so let me
Oh,
mention
absolutely.
Handspring itself came
Yes.
up with something called the Handspring Treo, and
You're
then
right.
Palm purchased Handspring, which was the reunification of some of those companies. And so then Palm and Handspring were together, and the Treo 650, which came out in 2004, was to
Yes.
me a truly revolutionary device. And in fact, I have one here in my desk. Sometimes I've showed it in this podcast many times in the past, that it
Yes.
was the first time that Palm integrated a cell phone in a way that really worked
Yeah.
well. So it was a
Right.
good cell phone that you could use for all of your telephone. You can use it as a true blue cell phone, worked great. But in addition, it took advantage of that cell phone connectivity to have true data in the phone.
Yeah.
So it was no longer necessary for me to carry a Palm device and a BlackBerry, or a Palm device and a good G100, but I could just have that Palm Treo 650 and everything was in one device. And at this point, we've long since passed the point of color screens. Now there were even better color screens with even better backlighting. There were so many apps that were available for it. You could easily, now that you have the connectivity, you could download them over the internet. They were more expensive than iPhone
Yeah.
apps tend to be at the time because they're more limited. But I mean, this is, if I, give what the iPhone is now and certainly was when it came out, the Palm Treo was certainly, one step behind it. Not quite as advanced as the
Absolutely.
iPhone, but it was truly getting almost there. And you can absolutely see a lot of the innovations that were shown off in the Treo 650 that directly led to the iPhone. I got a Palm Treo in 2004, and I used it for many, many years. And it was the last thing that I used before I got the iPhone. So while I was
Yeah.
using the Palm Treo 650,
Same.
what were you using?
Yeah. No, no doubt about that. 650 to me, that was the biggest. I think when that started getting into the hands of people, Jeff, there you go. You got yours still. I think I still have mine somewhere as well because it was such an amazing device. The
Yeah, it
fact
fit
that
in your
we could,
hand so nice, and
yeah, I mean, it was a little chunky, certainly by today's standards,
by
but it
today's
just
standards,
had
yeah.
access. Yeah, you had access to still a hardware keyboard, which a lot of people still bemoan the fact that that's, gone. You had some of those fast track, shortcut buttons, if you will, there at the top. You had the ability, it had the antenna, and of course the stylus. You had the antenna. I mean, this to me was the vision of where this was going to go. Now, just quickly, this is in 2004, like you said. I remember I received a Treo 600. Now, that was really right at the end of 2003.
Yeah.
And I think quickly that Handspring or Palm at the time, or Palm 1, that they realized, hey, we need to make some improvements. Like, this is a huge leap on there. And in fact, here, I think this is an article I wrote for the Plain Dealer at the time, and I said on the 600, this was in December 2003, my quest for the perfect PDA phone combo is over. In one tightly integrated package, the new Handspring at the time, Treo 600, has effectively replaced 3 of my old devices: my cell phone, my text pager, and my old Palm personal digital assistant.
There you go. That's it. Yeah.
That's what I said in 2003, December 2003, Jeff, because it was such a watershed moment. And then I think it was just a few months later that the 650 came out.
Yeah.
The screen was so much improved. Just the fact that I think it was so much more streamlined in the sense of like being able to have cell access. The calls sounded great. I just remember, like, that was even such a big deal. Like, that was the fact I could make a phone call wherever I am. Obviously, we had some of these phones, but then I can also look down at it and I can get access to information. And I remember the web browser was so molasses slow. It was so terrible.
It was so slow.
But
oh my goodness.
I loved it. Like, I embraced it because I had the fact that I could just get access to it at any time. I remember I always used to use it with a headset. Like, there was a wired headset because I would always want to be able to look at something when I was talking with somebody on the screen. And I remember so fondly sitting there always with the Treo 650 in my hand and just surfing around. And it worked on that Good Technology service as well, by the way. And so we were able to use that back end for the Good Technology to be able to access everything on the Treo 600, or the 650, as it were.
Yeah.
And of course, it was still so slow. This even had a Bluetooth capacity in it, but it was working on like the edge networks, which was just a little crazy. But it was still around. It says it lasted until 2008. So the Treo 650, there's a lot. Whenever I show this on a presentation, Jeff, everybody is always like, "Oh yeah!" Like, so many people had the Treo 650. It was really a watershed moment in what we're talking about here, and that's exactly the same for me. I use this as my primary device until I got my iPhone.
One of the things that made me sad is I remember I was living in New York City. I was there for about 8 months after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, so in late 2005 and 2006. And at the time, there were very, very heavy rumors that Apple was working on a phone. And nothing had been announced yet, because I guess the iPhone itself came out in 2007, was announced in I think January of 2007, I forget. But
right. That's right.
So nothing official had been announced yet, but everybody knew that Apple was working on something. And so I was in New York City and I was in a cab and I jumped out of my cab and somehow my Treo was in my coat pocket and it slipped out and I left it in the cab and I never got it again. And I'm like, okay, first of all, this was devastating because I love my Treo 650. But second of all, even though I had loved it and used it for so many years, I knew that Apple was so close. Now, it turned out it was a couple years away from me, but at the time I thought it might be months away that I'd be getting some sort of an Apple phone. And but they didn't have anything available. And so I had to go buy another Treo 650. And at the time that I bought it, I remember thinking, because this was in like early 2006, I remember thinking, am I going to buy this new Treo and use it for like a month? And then Apple's going to come out with whatever their device is. And of course, it turned out it was another 2 years before I bought something. But fortunately, once I got the new device, I was able to, use that syncing technology to get all of my information back on it again and stuff. And I laugh because information that is on there are some things on my iPhone today which came from my Treo, which came from my early Palm, which some of it even dates all the way back to that original Sharp organizer that I was using in the early 1990s, because I've just synced it over time and it's sort of come across over time and stuff like that.
Can,
Before
can I?
before we end
Yeah.
up, you go ahead next.
Well, I was just going to say a couple of other things I just wanted to point out leading up into the iPhone that
This
I
is
was
what I
kind of
wanted to ask you
seeing
about. Yeah.
some of, yeah, seeing some of the writing on the wall on this. First of all, I had that Cassiopeia, the Pocket PC, that was still going on. Now, it wasn't quite as amazing, I think, as what the 650, but another one of these Pocket PCs that I had was from Dell of all places. So this was in 2004. They had the Dell Axim, AXIM
Hmm.
X30. And this was a big deal for me because, again, it wasn't something that I used as my daily driver because at this point, the 650 was the only thing pretty much that I was going with. And
Hmm.
this had Wi-Fi on it, but again, it was very, very slow. And I already sitting right on the wall with the 650 on there. But I said like this was amazing to me that Dell was even delving into this aspect of going into the Pocket PC. It's a mighty impressive follow-up. Now, it's just a handheld on that, but that was interesting because, again, Windows was still offering that Windows CE for a long time. And the last thing quickly I wanted to talk about before we get into even the iPhone is like the year before, 2006, we talk about the Palm Treo 650, of course, running the Palm operating system. But this is how crazy it was. There was a
This is
Treo
crazy,
700.
crazy.
There was a Treo 700W, which was basically a 650, if nothing else. I think there's probably a picture of it down
Very
here,
similar.
maybe
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
But it was very similar. But instead of running the Palm operating system, it was running a Windows version of Windows CE. At the time, it was called Windows Mobile 5.0. So I just want people to get into that headspace. This is 2006, right before, or it actually was released at the end of 2005, right before Apple was getting. But this was the world that Steve Jobs was observing, right? And we know from some of the history now, Jeff, that even over these years, there were several people in very secret dark corners of Apple that were studying this, right? And watching exactly what was going on. But I just wanted to mention that little brief blip that people so often miss, that there was a Palm Treo 700 running a Windows mobile operating system. I never had it because at that time, similar to what you were talking about, Jeff, we knew that Apple was working on something and we were kind of all waiting on the edge there for what that was coming up. But it's just interesting to me that something like that was even happening. Like that was almost unbelievable that there was this is
There you
the
go.
700
Yeah, it looks exactly like a 650.
700WX.
Yeah.
Exactly. This was running on the Sprint network. I remember at the time I was using Sprint myself, by Palm. Anyway, just wanted to make that, like, to me, all of those things coming together was what was setting the stage literally for January 2007 when Steve Jobs was going to take it and introduce the original iPhone.
When there was a version of Palm that ran Windows CE or whatever it was
You,
called at the time, I just thought that that was crazy pants. And
yeah,
frankly,
yeah,
I think, I almost think it was a mistake. I mean, I think it sort of evidences that Palm, although it had some amazing technology, and the stuff that they came out with in the late 1990s was just unbelievable. And it was such a
yeah,
strong company for so long. Palm had
absolutely.
such problems at the executive level. The company kept getting purchased by other companies. People were
Yep,
leaving,
yep,
and all of these smart engineers had great ideas. It needed a leader like a Steve Jobs to really pull it all together. And they sort of lost their way. They could have been. I mean, I can imagine an alternate world in which, Brett, you and I are in the year 2024
sure.
staunch advocates of Palm devices. That
True.
could have
You're
happened,
right.
but it
You're
didn't
right.
because of all the problems that with the technology and the corporate side and everything else. Palm sort of lost its way. Other companies did too. And so, I mean, let's just talk a tiny bit about the beginning of the iPhone. The original iPhone is announced in January of 2007. Steve has what is, of all the Steve Jobs keynote announcements that he did over the years,
Yeah.
this I think was perhaps his best. If I will still go back every once in a
Agreed.
while and rewatch the 5 minutes where he introduced the iPhone. He was a master showman.
Yeah.
He's just nobody was better than Steve when it came to introducing a new product. No product was more interesting than the iPhone. And of course, that first generation iPhone was so limited in so many ways. I mean, it used, as you mentioned before, that edge network. This was before an early version of cellular data that was
Yeah.
so ridiculously slow. It was like turtles were moving your data back and forth. It had lots of other problems too. It did not have third-party apps. It was missing a
Right.
million different things. It was relatively slow, so much so that they even came up with a new thing that if you were scrolling a web page faster than the web page could be rendered on the screen, they would show this checkered grid so that you could just at least see a checkered grid moving and have an indication that you were scrolling. But at the same time, it was revolutionary. I mean, one of the big things at the time was that they had the idea that why do you need to have half of the face of your phone taken up by this keyboard? Let's have the entire face of the phone be a writing area. We'll bring up a software keyboard when you need it, but we'll put it away when you don't need it, and to have so much more space on the screen. And at the time, people that used BlackBerry were like, "Oh, I would never want to give up my keyboard, never." But of course, over time, everybody realized that was ridiculous, and the writing was on the wall for BlackBerry and that company.
Right.
That's the end of the BlackBerry movie. If you watch it, is when the iPhone comes out and they're like, "Oh my goodness, what are we going to do?" And so at that time, the iPhone it had so many great ideas. It was so revolutionary that companies like BlackBerry and Palm started justifiably to worry about what is our future going to be. So that was the first version, was in 07. I did not have the very first iPhone version. You did though, right? You got the first generation iPhone?
I did. So we talked about this 2007. It was January 9th, 2007 when Steve Jobs took the stage. And one of the pictures that's just burned in my mind from that presentation, Jeff, to your point, was I remember how he introduced this. He's like, what if you could have an iPod, a phone, and internet in your hand? And he did it like 3 times, just like iPod, phone, internet. And if you watch the video, it's like he just gets everybody hyped up so much, and then he drops the bomb that the iPhone is coming out, and it's all 3 of those things, which is weird because the iPod was like a device. We all had iPods. The phone was like a service, and the internet was like, that's something that you do on a computer. And it was just weird. I felt like how he did that, but it was, like you said, masterful in the way he did that. But that was in January 2007. The phone was not actually available until June of that year.
Summer,
so it was June 29th, 2007. So I remember at the time, and I know you had to be watching as well, it's like, okay, is this something I'm going to do? Because it was like, I think the original price was $499. It was $500, which at the time was like, wow, like that's incredible that you would charge something that much for the phone. But like you said, it was different. We were wondering, was it going to work? I mean, now we've seen, like I said, from the history, like it was just kind of held together by duct tape at the time, right? When Steve Jobs was even announcing it. And it's amazing that it did. I remember the other thing specifically too, Jeff, as well, I didn't use AT&T for any of those other devices. I was most of the time I was Sprint and Verizon. But I remember there was a big announcement. I don't know if it was in January, maybe it was, that it was only going to be available on AT&T, right? And so that was a big deal, like, because I'd never done AT&T. I was always going to be Sprint. I was going to be Verizon. And at the time, it was like, well, wait a minute, I don't want to switch my carrier. So that was another kind of a hurdle for me, at least. After June 2007, I knew eventually I was going to get one. But it was February 2008. So I lasted about a little over about 7 months, or, so it's 8 months. It's like, I knew I was going to get it, but in February 2008, I remember, okay, now I'm finally at the point. I went down to the local Apple store here in Cleveland, and I got it. So I do have, and I still have, it's not this pretty because it was handed down to the kids over all these years, because, it could fetch a lovely price today if it was perfect in the box. But it's been well loved and well used. And frankly, I could still go power it up right now, which is unbelievable that I could still do something like that. I got to find the right cable connector on there. But it was in February, and I just remember that was my switch from the Palm Treo 650, Jeff. And it was insane how much better that it was from the 650. Just to be able to scroll, I'm looking at a website, just like I looked at it's on a mobile version. All of my email is syncing. By that time, I was into the Mac side already anyway. It already had a Mac. So everything was working. And I remember looking, I found the same day, it was February 2nd, 2008. Because I remember in my email, I still have when I signed up for the iTunes account on that same day. Like I came back from the store and I signed up for that account. And I'm like, I can sync music to the iPhone. Like, this is wait, I can go access and download the song. And of course, at the time, still, we didn't have the third-party apps, right? And that was another big thing that I was a little nervous about, because I wanted to be able to do that on there. But anyway, that was my little story. So February 2008 was my first iPhone, the original iPhone, which, by the way, was 2G. right? It
Yeah.
wasn't even 3G at the time. I mean, but I was still so thrilled with the speeds that we had even at that time.
So I wanted to get that first generation iPhone, and I thought that I would. In fact, that's why I was so upset that I had to buy the replacement Treo 650. But then when
Right.
Apple actually announced the iPhone, it was missing something critical for me. And I'm not talking
Yes.
about third-party apps, but what I'm talking about was the ability to work with Microsoft Exchange for corporate email. And this is the thing
Yes.
that, as we talked about
Yes.
before, both BlackBerry
Yes.
and Good were so they were so smart.
That's right.
BlackBerry actually had a server that would be a part of your network for your company, and so
Right.
that you could securely get email back and forth to your company in a way that it wasn't just being exposed on the internet. I mean, for every business, privacy was important, but especially for those of us in the business of law, communications are supposed to be private between attorneys and clients. And so we
Right.
have a
Right.
legal
Right.
responsibility to
It
keep
was
that stuff
big.
confidential.
Yeah.
And so I needed something that was going to work with Exchange and my corporate email. And that original iPhone did not. It did have mail on it, but it would just be with regular mail or with Yahoo Mail or something
Right.
like that, private mail service.
Pop.
It was
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
working with Microsoft Exchange. So as much as I wanted to get the first generation iPhone like you did, I just couldn't do it because I needed to have email. It was too important.
Right.
And so the second generation iPhone, which was called the iPhone 3G,
There it is.
they put 3G in the name to let you know that it was using what at the time was a much faster
Right.
network. Nowadays, we think of 3G as being ridiculously slow, that that's not even supported
Right.
by networks anymore. But at the time, it was much faster than that Edge network, the 2G network. And so one of the big advantages of that new iPhone was that it had the faster
Wow.
internet with 3G. Another advantage is it worked with the App Store, which Apple also announced that you could get third-party apps. But for
Yes.
people like me, the key thing was that it worked with Microsoft Exchange. So for
That
the
was it.
first time, I could actually do it. And so I remember that there was, where I work in downtown New Orleans, just a few blocks away from me on St. Charles Avenue, there is an AT&T store. By the way, when that first iPhone was announced, it was actually announced for
Yes.
singular. And then it was between the
Oh, you're
time of the
right.
announcement
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
between
Yeah.
January
Yeah.
and
That's
June,
right.
Singular
That's
changed
right.
its name to
I
AT&T
forgot
because of the
about
corporate
that.
purchase.
Yes.
So, but anyway, so there's an AT&T store down the street. And so I went to
That's
go
right.
line up. So I got there early in the morning, and because that was what people did with the original iPhone is you lined up in front of stores to get the first model. And so I got there super early and I got in line, and I was probably only like number 15 in line or something like that. But by the time I got to the front of the line, they had already sold, like they didn't have in stock any of them anymore
What?
that I wanted. And so although I had gotten in line on July 11th, I then had to order it and wait for it to come. So I paid for
Okay.
it on
Okay.
July 11th, which was the day it debuted, but I didn't actually get it for another 11 days until July 2022 of 2008. And I know that date only because, back at that time when I was using my Palm 650, I used to use Twitter, and I used it on the computer as well. And
Right.
I remember that I went back in time and I found on my Twitter history, like the very first tweet that I did for my phone. It was on July 22nd, 2008. I said, "This is a tweet from my
Wow.
new Palm 3G," which is the only reason I remember that date. But
Yeah.
so that was that was not this date. This was later. But so anyway, that was when I finally jumped onto the iPhone bandwagon, and at that point, I was on
Wow.
iPhone ever since, and I don't see myself changing anytime soon. It's funny
No.
because at this same period of
Yeah.
time, you had the original iPhone and then the iPhone 3G. Meanwhile, BlackBerry, people are starting to move in droves from the
Oh yeah.
BlackBerry to the
Oh
iPhone.
yes.
Um,
Oh yes.
Microsoft, its Pocket PC, Windows CE system was no longer very popular. It was sort of going
Nope.
away. Palm was still around, and I remember in 2009. So a year after I bought this iPhone 3G, Palm came out with something called the Palm Pre, Pre, which was supposed to
Yeah.
be the next generation of Palm. At this point, Palm was run by a guy named uh, Rubenstein, if it was the first name. He used to
Okay.
work for Apple, and he was one of the people that was responsible for the introduction of the iPhone and Apple. And I'm forgetting Rubenstein's first name, but then he went over to Palm and he took over the company and he was going to introduce it. And it came out, and the Palm Pre did have some pretty revolutionary interface ideas that
I
they had.
remember this. Yeah. Flip up
And
the
one of
keyboard.
the
Yeah. That's
one of the
cool.
very early posts that I did on iPhone JD, because I started writing iPhone JD soon after I got my iPhone. So that was in late 2008, in around November of 2008. I remember writing a post on iPhone JD
You
in
were a
2009
visionary.
where I talked about the Palm Pre and what were the advantages and disadvantages versus an iPhone. But it was really sort of the beginning of the end. I mean, Palm came up with that Pre. It did not sell very well, and And, I called it at the time the first true competitor to the iPhone. But the reality
I
is
see
that although it had some very cool ideas in it, don't get me wrong, from a technology standpoint, it was actually very neat. But from a consumer at this point, if the iPhone was gaining in popularity so much, I mean, Apple's growth was just, if you looked at it on a chart, was just exponential. BlackBerry's growth was falling, Palm was already low, and they never came back. And then, but for Google coming out with its version of Android, Google was coming out with Android phones at the time. And then right around the time that Apple introduced the iPhone, suddenly Google just changed all of their efforts. And every Android after that looked very much like an iPhone. They said, okay, Apple's figured out what these things should look like. You don't want to have keyboards. And even to this day, Android continues to look like, and you can talk about, intellectual property stuff, whether that's appropriate or not. But, Apple was so revolutionary with the early iPhone that, except for Google having its Android alternative, we no longer really had viable alternatives from BlackBerry, Palm, Casio, Sharp, all these other technology companies that we talked about for the decades before the iPhone came out, all of which in their time were revolutionary and were so important in coming up with new ideas, and everybody rested on the shoulders of each other's. And so, we don't want to laugh at those early, Psion, even Radio Shack, the technology that they came out with at the time was so important at the time, and the future stuff did build upon it. But when the iPhone came out in 2007, and especially with that first generation change in 2008 with the App Store, that was really at that point, it was going to be all iPhone from then on, except for the Android.
Just amazing to see where we are today again, right? I mean, because I see a lot of these companies that have come and gone, or they've modified. I mean, even Windows, I remember, they still were a player for a while. You always do a good post from a couple of surveys that we follow in the legal sphere, at least a little bit, of like what lawyers are using. And I remember your little pie chart, Jeff, there would be some that would still be holding on to the Windows side. And then of course, Windows or Microsoft just said, we're done. We're done with that market. Yeah. And it's just to see how Apple has continued to evolve. To me, I mean, after all these years, the original iPhone is now 16 years, 17 years old. I mean, it's just amazing that, because we see some of these Palms in devices, and, maybe if it goes 5 years, 10 years, that's pretty incredible. But to see where Apple is today, it still continues just to be, blow me away on that. But okay, anyway, I know we thanks everybody for listening to us. It's just been fun for us to geek out on some of this. Yeah. And, as we mentioned, please make it a point, even if you just go through and you heard us talking about some things, you can go to the YouTube video just because so you can see some of the, I'll include some of the links, but you can see some of the devices that we're talking about. And it's just good sometimes to look back a little bit to see where we are today. I mean, it helps us to, I think, even better appreciate a lot of what we have these days, Jeff, and that's important as well. But also to see, like you said, to stand on the shoulders of the other things. I mean, even just look at this Palm Pre, I'd completely forgotten about that. But even just that idea of having that compactness is still important, I mean, that goes to the iPhone Mini is what I keep thinking. Jason Snell, such a big fan of the iPhone Mini, and then kind of that form factor there. So, good stuff. I really enjoyed that. Thanks, Jeff, for doing this. This was a lot of fun.
It was. So we should mention we're going to be off next week, right, Brett? We have a vacation break. And then we will be back in 2 weeks with the news of the day. And at that point, we'll be getting closer to the end of the summer with probably lots of new Apple announcements, but especially as we get into the fall with the new iPhone be announced and everything else. Gearing up for it to all come out in just a few weeks. So that's very exciting stuff. But it was great as we look forward to the future. Yeah. It was great walking down memory lane with you. This was awesome.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Brett. Bye-bye, everybody.